Family is supposed to be a place of love, a place where you belong without question. But what happens when the very people who brought you into the world deny your existence? Not in private, but in front of everyone. That night, under the glittering lights of my father's grand party, I learned the most painful truth. Sometimes, the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who call themselves family. And when my mother's words cut through the air, "You're not even family," I knew my reply would change everything. Fela walked into the large hall where his father's 60th birthday was being celebrated. The place was decorated with bright lights, flowers, and shining glasses filled with drinks. Guests were laughing, talking, and enjoying themselves, but Fela's heart felt heavy. He forced a smile as people greeted him, but deep inside, he knew something was missing. He had always felt like an outsider in his own home. His siblings seemed to fit in easily. His mother adored them, but when it came to him, there was always a wall between them. From childhood, he had noticed the difference. His mother's hugs were rare, her words were sharp, and her eyes often carried something cold whenever she looked at him. Still, he grew up holding on to the love of his father, who always made sure he felt valued. That love kept him going, even when his mother's silence cut deeper than words. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands with his father's friends and smiling politely at relatives, he couldn't help but feel both proud and nervous. Proud, because his father had achieved so much in life, becoming respected and admired by many. Nervous, because he never knew how long the peace in his family would last. Tonight, he just wanted to celebrate his father without any drama. His father, Chief Adeyemi, stood at the center of the room, greeting guests warmly, his laughter filling the hall. Fela looked at him with admiration. No matter how tough life had been, this man had always been his rock. It was for him that Fela had come tonight, with a determined smile, choosing to ignore the unease that always lingered in his chest. But as he sat quietly at a corner table, he couldn't stop himself from noticing how his mother, Alora, barely acknowledged him. She greeted others with smiles and warmth, but when her eyes fell on him, they carried the same coldness he had known all his life. It was almost as if she wished he wasn't there. Fela's heart tightened, but he brushed it aside. This was his father's night, and he would not let anything spoil it. Still, somewhere deep inside, he carried a strange feeling, like a shadow that followed him. He didn't know why, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something waiting to happen. And though he tried to push the thought away, he could not ignore the weight pressing down on him. For Fela, this night was supposed to be about honoring his father, about showing gratitude for the man who had raised him with love. But he had no idea that before the night ended, one single sentence would cut through the celebration and change his life forever. When the music slowed down and the guests were asked to give their toasts, Fela's heart began to race. He knew his turn was coming, and he wanted to say the right words. His father had always been his strength, and tonight, in front of everyone, he wanted to honor him. When his name was called, he slowly stood up, holding his glass of wine in one hand. His palms were sweaty, and his hands shook slightly, but he forced a smile as he looked toward his father. The room grew quiet as he began to speak. His voice was soft at first, but soon it grew steadier. He thanked his father for being more than just a parent, for being a guide, a teacher, and a man who never gave up on him. He spoke of sacrifices that Chief Adeyemi had made, how he had worked day and night to give his children a good life. People nodded, touched by his words. Fela then began to speak about unity, about how family should stand together, no matter the challenges. But before he could finish, a sharp laugh cut through the hall. It was not the laugh of joy, but of mockery, and it made everyone stop. The sound came from his mother, Alora. She sat at the front table, her expression cold, her eyes locked on Fela. She leaned forward, and in a voice that carried clearly through the microphone, she said, "You shouldn't talk about family, Fela. You're not even family." The words struck harder than any slap. The glass in Fela's hand trembled as whispers rose among the guests. Forks and spoons stopped in mid-air, and no one moved. The hall that was moments ago filled with music and chatter was now silent, heavy with shock. Guests looked at one another, unsure of what to do. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others stared at Alora, unable to believe she had said such a thing. Fela stood frozen, his chest tightening as if the air had been sucked out of the room. For years, he had felt the coldness of his mother, but never had he expected her to expose him like this, not in front of everyone. His siblings looked down at their plates, avoiding his eyes as if shame had pinned them to their seats. His father's face turned pale, and his hand gripped the edge of the table, trembling slightly. Fela could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let the tears come. He swallowed hard, trying to hold himself steady, even though the ground beneath him felt like it was falling apart. That one sentence from his mother had changed the entire mood of the party. What was meant to be a night of celebration had suddenly turned into a night of painful truth, and everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. The hall that had been full of laughter just moments ago now felt like it was trapped in a storm of silence. After Alora's words, no one dared to move. The guests sat frozen, their spoons and forks left hanging in the air. It was as if the whole world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence pressed down on Fela's chest, heavy and unkind, making it hard for him to breathe. His siblings could not meet his eyes. Jalu kept shifting uncomfortably in his seat, staring at the floor, as though the tiles were suddenly the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Kemi reached for her glass of water, her hands shaking slightly, but she didn't dare look at her brother. Osi, the youngest, sank back in his chair, guilt written all over his face. Each one of them knew how their mother treated Fela differently, but they had never imagined she would say it out loud for everyone to hear. At the head table, Chief Adeyemi's face turned pale. His lips trembled, as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. He looked at his wife in disbelief, his eyes full of disappointment. The man who had always held himself with such pride now looked smaller, weighed down by the truth that had just been exposed. The guests noticed his expression, and some of them whispered quietly among themselves. Others covered their mouths in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard from the mouth of the celebrant's wife. For Fela, every second of silence felt like an hour. His heart pounded so hard he thought everyone could hear it. He had always known that his mother's love for him was different, always colder, always distant. But hearing her deny him as family in front of so many people was like a knife to his chest. His suspicions were now confirmed. She had never wanted him. She had never seen him as her own. He stood there, holding tightly to his glass, his fingers trembling slightly, but he refused to let it fall. He refused to let his pain show in front of the very people waiting for his reaction. Instead of breaking down, he lifted his chin a little higher. The hurt inside him was sharp, but so was his strength. He realized that if he bowed his head, his mother would win. And so, in that heavy silence, Fela chose to stand taller, ready to face whatever would come next. Fela stood in the middle of the hall, his glass still in his hand, his heart beating painfully inside his chest. The silence that surrounded him felt endless, and all eyes were fixed on him, waiting to see if he would collapse under the weight of his mother's words. But instead of breaking, he drew a deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and filled with strength that no one expected. He looked straight at his mother and said, "If I am not family, then tell us all, Mother. Why did Dad raise me as his own? Why did he give me his name, his love, his home?" His words cut through the air like a sharp knife, and the entire hall reacted with shock. A wave of gasps spread from table to table as guests turned to look at Alora, their eyes wide, waiting for her reply. Chief Adeyemi's eyes filled with tears. He had always been proud of his son's courage, but hearing him speak those words in public broke something deep inside him. He had kept his silence for many years, hiding truths that weighed on his heart, but now everything was rising to the surface, whether he was ready or not. He reached out a hand slightly toward Fela, his lips trembling, but he could not speak. Alora's face burned red. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no sound came out. For years, she had carried bitterness quietly, using coldness to show her dislike, but never once had she been forced to face it in front of so many people. Now, her son had challenged her openly, and every pair of eyes in that room was waiting for her to answer. She tried to find her voice, but her throat tightened. The words she wanted to throw back at him refused to leave her lips. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked at Fela with sympathy, admiring his courage. Others shook their heads in disbelief at Alora, whispering that no mother should speak to her child that way. It was as if the glittering lights hanging above them were suddenly shining directly on the hidden cracks of the family, exposing everything that had been covered for years. Fela stood tall, his eyes locked on his mother's, his calmness stronger than her silence. He did not raise his voice, he did not shout, but his reply shook the entire room more than any loud outburst could. For the first time, he was no longer the quiet son who carried his pain silently. He had spoken his truth, and the weight of his words could not be ignored. The whispers in the hall grew louder with every passing second. Guests leaned toward one another, their eyes darting between Fela, Alora, and Chief Adeyemi. Everyone was waiting for someone to speak, for someone to break the heavy silence. At last, Chief Adeyemi slowly rose from his chair. His movements were shaky, and his face looked pale. He reached for the microphone with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with emotions he could no longer hide. The room became still again as all attention turned to him. He cleared his throat, but his voice wavered when he finally spoke. "There is something I must say," he began, his words breaking under the weight of years he had carried this secret. "What your mother said tonight is not without reason. Fela, he is not Alora's son." Gasps filled the hall, and heads turned sharply in disbelief. People could not believe what they were hearing. Chief Adeyemi took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, as if every word was costing him strength. "Before I married Alora," he continued, his voice heavy, "there was another woman. She was my first love. We shared a bond, and from that bond, Fela was born." His eyes shifted toward his son, and his lips trembled. "But when fate separated us, I made a promise. I swore that no matter what happened, I would raise Fela as my own blood. I would give him my name, my love, and my home." The revelation struck the hall like a thunderclap. The truth that had been buried for decades was now out in the open. Some guests sat frozen, unable to blink, while others placed their hands on their chests in shock. The weight of the confession was too much for many to take in all at once. Murmurs swept across the room again, people whispering about how such a secret could be hidden for so long. Alora's face hardened, her eyes flashing with anger and humiliation. For years she had carried the bitterness of raising a child that wasn't her own, and now the very truth she had tried to bury had been laid bare for everyone to see. Her jaw tightened as she looked away, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Meanwhile, Fela stood frozen, his heart pounding as his father's words sank in. He had always wondered why his mother treated him differently, why her love never reached him the way it reached his sibling. Now he understood. He was not hers, and she had carried that resentment every day of his life. The pain cut deep, but so did the love shining from his father's tearful eyes. Chief Adeyemi held the microphone tighter and finished with a voice heavy with emotion. "He may not be Alora's son, but he is mine, and nothing will ever change that." The hall grew heavy with silence after Chief Adeyemi's confession. Eyes turned to Alora, searching for her reaction, but her face was hard and unrepentant. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their lips pressed tight, while others shook their heads in quiet disbelief. A few even pitied Fela, who stood frozen under the weight of the truth that had just been thrown into the open. His siblings avoided his eyes, their gazes darting nervously between him and their mother. The shame that clouded their faces revealed that even they had not known how deep Alora's bitterness went. Jalu, the youngest, leaned closer and whispered with trembling lips, "Brother, I didn't know." His words were soft, but they pierced through Fela's heart. For years he had carried the quiet ache of his mother's rejection, brushing it aside as if it were a mistake, a misunderstanding, or something he had caused. But now he understood. Her coldness had never been accidental. It was a wound she had chosen to keep open, a bitterness that had never healed. Fela's throat tightened as he swallowed back tears. His father had loved him, yes, and had given him his name and protection, but the warmth he had longed for from his mother had always been withheld. Tonight, before the eyes of the community, she had turned that private wound into a public humiliation. She had not just cut him down with words, she had tried to strip away his worth, to remind him that in her eyes, he was never enough. The guests murmured among themselves, and the sound filled the hall like a restless tide. Some glared at Alora with open disgust, unable to understand how a mother could use her son's deepest pain as a weapon. Others avoided Fela's eyes, ashamed for him, unsure of what comfort they could offer in such a raw moment. Fela stood tall, though his chest burned. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult he had ever faced. It wasn't only about the truth of his birth, it was about the cruelty of being reminded that the woman who should have loved him most had chosen spite over compassion. Her resentment had followed him like a shadow his entire life, and now, in front of all, she had made sure it would haunt him forever. But as he looked around the room, locking eyes with his siblings and seeing the shame on their faces, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he was not the one who should be ashamed. It was Alora, and that truth gave him the strength to keep standing, even as his heart ached. Fela felt the sting of his mother's words still burning in his chest, but he refused to let them crush him. The hall had gone silent, all eyes on him, waiting to see if he would break down or storm out. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and lifted his glass once more. His voice was calm, but it carried strength that filled every corner of the room. He said, "If being family means living in cruelty, envy and lies, then I am glad I don't belong to that definition." Gasps rippled across the room, but he did not stop. He looked directly at his mother, his eyes steady, and added, "Because my father's love has always been enough for me, and tonight I don't stand here as an outsider. I stand as his son, the son he never abandoned." For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air like fire, heavy and impossible to ignore. People shifted in their seats, some lowering their heads in shame, others nodding as if they had been waiting for someone to say those exact words. Then, slowly, a few hands clapped. Soon, the sound grew louder. Applause echoed around the hall, rising higher with every passing second, until it turned into a standing ovation. Some guests even whistled in admiration, their cheers breaking through the tension that had poisoned the evening. Fela felt his chest rise with pride, not because he had won against his mother, but because he had finally spoken his truth without fear. His siblings stared at him with wide eyes, guilt written all over their faces. Jalu, still seated, whispered again, "Brother, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." But this time, Fela only nodded faintly. He understood. The anger was no longer in control of him. Instead, strength flowed where pain once lived. Chief Adeyemi, his father, had tears welling up in his eyes. He pressed his hand over his heart, overwhelmed by the courage his son had shown. He had carried the secret for decades, afraid it would destroy the boy he loved. But now, watching Fela stand tall in the face of betrayal, he realized his son was stronger than he had ever imagined. Alora, however, sat frozen in her chair, her face turned red, then pale. The applause that filled the room was like knives cutting into her pride. Her plan to humiliate Fela had backfired. Instead of breaking, he had risen higher. Instead of shame, he had gained honor. And for the first time that night, she had nothing to say. Chief Adeyemi's hands trembled as he stood up from his chair. His eyes, wet with unshed tears, searched for Fela through the crowd. Slowly, he walked toward him, each step heavy with years of silence, years of hidden truth, years of love that had never been fully spoken aloud. When he finally reached him, he did not hesitate. He pulled Fela into his arms in front of everyone. The hall grew still, every guest holding their breath. Then, in a voice that carried both pain and pride, Chief Adeyemi declared, "You are my son, my blood or not. Nothing changes that." His words broke through the thick air of gossip and doubt. The whispers that had been circling like poison disappeared. No one dared speak against the chief's words, because they knew this was not just a father defending his child. It was a man reclaiming his truth. Fela felt his father's embrace as if it was the first real shelter he had ever known. His heart pounded, not from shame, but from a deep sense of belonging. For so long, he had lived with the coldness of his mother, the sideways glances of relatives, the unspoken questions. But now, in front of everyone, his father's love became his shield. The same people who once doubted him now looked at him with respect. He had not begged for validation. He had earned it by standing strong. Alora's face twisted with fury. She tried to speak, but her voice was drowned in the silence that no longer gave her power. Her years of bitterness, her sharp tongue, her endless control, none of it could match the simple strength of a father's public declaration of love. For the first time, she was the outsider in her own story. She stormed out of the hall, her footsteps echoing, but no one rose to follow her, not even her other children. Their eyes stayed fixed on Fela and Chief Adeyemi, drawn to the bond that had just been sealed before their very eyes. The guests shifted, but this time with admiration. Some even clapped softly, others smiled with tears in their eyes. They had come expecting scandal, expecting whispers and shame, but instead, they had witnessed a father stand for his son in a way few men ever did. Fela stood tall, no longer broken, no longer questioning his worth. The humiliation that was meant to destroy him had turned into a crown of dignity. He was not just Chief Adeyemi's son, he was the son who had faced betrayal and still walked out whole. In that moment, the story changed forever. The weight of Alora's cruelty collapsed, and the strength of love rose in its place. All eyes saw it clearly. Fela was not a mistake, not an outsider, not a shadow. He was the son chosen by love, and that truth could never be taken away. The hall that had been filled with laughter, music, and clinking glasses slowly shifted into a place of reflection. The celebration was no longer about decorations or the sweet taste of cake. People whispered to one another, not about the food or the outfits, but about what they had just witnessed. They spoke about courage, about the power of truth, and about what family really meant. The story of the night had changed. It was no longer a birthday party. It had become a moment of revelation that would be remembered for years to come. Fela stood quietly in the middle of it all, his chest still heavy from the words he had spoken. Yet for the first time in his life, that weight no longer felt like a burden. He looked around and saw faces, faces that had once dismissed him, now filled with respect. Guests approached him, not with pity, but with admiration. They told him he had spoken like a man who knew his worth. Some even admitted they had never seen such bravery inside this family before. His siblings stood at a distance, shame written across their faces. For years, they had let him carry the pain alone. They had watched as whispers cut him like knives, but they had said nothing. Tonight, however, something in them shifted. They walked towards him, slowly at first, then with urgency. One by one, they promised him they would never let him feel like an outsider again. They told him that from this night forward, they would stand beside him, no matter what. Their voices trembled, but the sincerity in their eyes was undeniable. Fela's heart softened. He had dreamed of this moment, though he never thought it would come. For the first time in years, he did not feel invisible. He did not feel like a shadow hiding at the edges of his own home. He felt seen, he felt acknowledged, and above all, he felt loved. The guests clapped gently, not for drama but for truth. Many whispered to each other that they would go home and rethink the way they treated their own families. They realized that family was not about perfect bloodlines or flawless appearances. It was about standing together, about love, and about acceptance. As the night wore on, Fela stood taller. His scars had not vanished, but they had transformed into something beautiful, symbols of strength. He looked at his father, at his sibling, at the guests who now saw him in a different light, and he realized something. This night had not just changed his story, it had redefined what family truly meant, and in that quiet truth, he finally felt at peace. The night was supposed to end like every other celebration, with laughter, dancing, and memories people would talk about for weeks. But what stayed in everyone's heart was not Alora's bitter outburst, nor the cruelty she had tried to spread. It was Fela's reply. His words had cut through the noise of gossip, envy, and lies, reaching everyone in the hall like a truth they had always known, but never dared to speak. People would not remember the humiliation she tried to create. They would remember the strength of the young man who refused to be broken. His voice carried a weight that silence could not bury. He did not fight with anger, nor did he throw insults. Instead, he stood tall and chose courage, showing everyone that love was louder than shame and dignity stronger than cruelty. That night, his reply became more than just words. It became a lesson, a mirror, a legacy. The whispers that had once mocked him turned into respect. The same crowd that might have doubted him now admired him. Chief Adeyemi stood by his side, his arm resting proudly on his son's shoulder, as though sealing the moment forever. Together, they walked out of the hall, not as a broken family, but as a stronger one. Every eye followed them, not with pity, but with admiration. Guests knew they had witnessed history, not the kind written in books, but the kind carved into hearts. They had seen a boy transform into a man, and a father declare to the world that love was greater than bloodline secrets. As the night faded, Fela carried with him a new strength. He had always feared being seen as less, but now he knew the truth. That sometimes the deepest pain is what shapes the strongest voice. His words had already planted themselves into the memories of everyone who heard them, and they would be retold again and again, like a story passed down to inspire others. Alora's cruelty might have started the fire, but it was Fela's courage that turned it into light. His reply would outlive the shame, outlast the whispers, and overshadow every attempt to break him. And as he stepped into the cool night with his father's embrace around him, he realized something powerful. Family is not built on fear or pride, but on loyalty, truth, and the kind of love that never abandons. That was the legacy he left behind that night. Not of pain, but of power. Not of rejection, but of acceptance. And in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, Fela's reply would always echo as the moment a son claimed his rightful place, not through blood, but through courage. If this story touched your heart, remember this. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. It's the ones who stand by you when the world tries to break you. Would you have stayed silent like Fela once did, or spoken up with courage when it mattered most? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear stories that remind us sometimes the strongest reply is the one that becomes a legacy.